Today's lecture is on GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We're going to pick up talking about the kinds of things we were talking about last time. And the two questions we're going to talk about are, how are genetically modified organisms used, and what are their potential benefits and risks? So if you remember from last time, we talked about how you make a transgenic organism. So this was how you made a transgenic fly. You injected DNA into its into the embryo before the cells form, and then transposable elements or jumping genes in that DNA can actually move your DNA into the chromosomes of the fly. We talked about how transgenic plants are made. So this is the example of using agrobacterium. You cut out little pieces of leaf, you infect those little pieces of leaf with a solution containing agrobacterium, which in turn contains the DNA you're interested in. Those leaves get infected, the agrobacterium transfers those genes into the plant's genome, and then from that leaf you add the right mix of plant hormones and you can actually grow up a full plant again. Or you could use a gene gun to do pretty much the same thing. We talked about a particularly frivolous use of transgenic organisms, which was these glowfish that are making fluorescent proteins and serve no other purpose except to glow brightly in your room. But we also talked about the major use of transgenic organisms by far, which is transgenic plants that are used either for food for us, for food for livestock, or for clothing, because a lot of, as you'll see in this lecture, a big proportion of transgenic plant is actually cotton, which is used for something other than eating. I talked about a few uses of transgenic plants. I talked about these papayas that were being wiped out in Hawaii and other parts of the world because they were being infected by this ring spot virus, and that's what the papaya trees look like when they're infected. And you can see here these trees going side by side with the infected ones are genetically modified papayas that are resistant to that virus, and you can see that on the aerial view where all the plants in the center are transgenic and all the plants on the outside are not, and the ones in the center are doing perfectly well even though the virus is there and would otherwise have infected them. I talked about golden rice, the idea there being that rice is a staple food, particularly in parts of the world where vitamin A deficiency is a problem, and that's not, those aren't unrelated statements. Rice has no vitamin A in it, and if someone's diet is mostly made up of rice, then they're likely to have a problem with vitamin A deficiency unless they're eating a varied diet otherwise. And so scientists have made genetically modified rice called golden rice that makes beta-carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A. We talked about sort of the idea behind that, how it actually was achieved by inserting enzymes into the rice that complete the pathway of beta-carotene synthesis. We talked about why that might be a good thing to have golden rice, why it might be a bad thing. And today what we're going to pick up on is some more of the social implications of making transgenic organisms a major part of our food supply. So this article from Scientific American from a few years back is one of your required reading articles. You should read it carefully, and it talks about what transgenic plants are, what genetically modified organisms or GMOs are, and what potential problems there are with them. And so, in particular, the article listed three areas where there was some amount of worry with regard to the widespread use of genetically modified organisms as part of our food supply. The first worry was that innocent creatures might be hurt by insecticides built into genetically modified crops. And there what they're talking about is the Bt toxin, which I talked about in last lecture. The idea that every cell of a plant is making this toxin that originally comes from bacteria. It's a very potent toxin that kills many different types of insects. And the idea is if you have fields and fields and fields planted with these plants that are making that toxin, then not only the bad insects are going to get killed, but also beneficial insects or insects that people have attachments to, like monarch butterflies. And so that could be a pretty serious byproduct of the widespread use of Bt modified crop varieties. And as of 2001, okay, at that point, the research was basically saying that indeed, if you put a monarch butterfly larva, a caterpillar, on Bt modified plant, the larva will get sick. Okay, so in principle, it's possible for a non-target insect, the one you're not trying to kill, to be harmed by the Bt crop. But also the limited, there hadn't been that much study done, but the limited field research that had been done suggests that it might not be too much of a practical problem because those insects would just not be attracted to those crops anyway. And there are other places for those insects to go. So that was sort of the state of that worry in 2001. Potential problem, but not a lot of field research done and not a lot of evidence that it would be a problem, but just a potential problem. Number two, super weeds will arise. So here what they're talking about is the other major modification of crop plants, and that's not to make a toxin against insects, but to make them resistant to an herbicide. So the idea being, and I've shown you this before, and I'll show you it again later in the lecture, that if you have a field growing that's genetically engineered so that it's resistant to a particular herbicide, then you can just drive a plane over that field and spray the entire field with the herbicide. The crop still grows and everything else dies. So it's sort of an efficient, at least in time, way to prevent weeds from growing in your fields. Now the problem with that, there's two potential problems with that. One is that if your crop, if the genes from your crop manage to get into wild species, either by crossing or by some other mechanism, then whatever species inherits those genes is also going to be resistant to that herbicide. So in an instant, you then get a super weed. You get a weed that can't be killed by the thing you're using to kill weeds. The other way that could happen is just because you're putting a really huge selection pressure on that field. So the way to think about it is, for example, the same as antibiotic resistance. So as humans, we get sick. We take antibiotics sometimes to get rid of bacterial infections. Because of the widespread use of antibiotics in humans, we have a really, really serious problem of antibiotic resistance. And so some illnesses that humans get are very, very difficult to treat because those bugs, those bacteria, basically are resistant to every antibiotic we could throw at them. Okay, you've heard of sort of these flesh-eating bacteria that are multi-drug resistant and this kind of thing. Well, the same thing happens in any situation where there's a really strong selection pressure. So the really strong selection pressure in this case is an herbicide that kills weeds, okay? And so even if it's very rare for a plant to evolve resistance to that herbicide on its own, that is by not being genetically engineered, even if that's a rare occurrence, if you're doing it in such a widespread way, you're spraying acres and acres and acres of land with that chemical, eventually some plant is going to pop up that's resistant to it. And the instant that happens, it will spread like crazy because it's not being killed anymore. Okay? So that's what we call a superweed, right? And as of 2001, there were no superweeds found, okay? But anecdotal reports had surfaced about, well, maybe there's this weed growing in Farmer Joe's field. Maybe that's a superweed. And it was a concern for the two reasons I gave. One is widespread use of the chemical. It's only, it's bound to happen that there will be resistant weeds eventually. But also, pollen from genetically modified plants can often fertilize relative plants that are weeds, right? Plants that like growing in the same conditions as the plant you're trying to grow as a crop. And so the idea was, well, maybe you can try and segregate that. You can not plant genetically modified crops near where there's a reservoir of these relatives that might become serious weed problems. Okay? And then the third worry was that genetically modified crops will suddenly fail, okay, for any one of the reasons I've already named. For example, insect pests might evolve resistance to the built-in Bt toxin, or weeds will take over the fields and you won't be able to do anything about it, and your corn or your canola or whatever you've genetically modified won't grow anymore. Or, as I'll talk about a little bit later, just by virtue of growing the same plant over a large percentage of arable land, if any chance event happens that's bad for that plant, it's going to affect the whole crop, much of the food supply. So, for example, if this genetically modified corn that you're using does perfectly well normally, but in an especially dry year or an especially wet year it doesn't do very well, then it's a problem if every farm is growing that corn, okay, because you'll have major losses of food. Okay? So again, as of 2001, no major failures had been documented, but it's still a major worry because there's nothing that I said that's sort of far out in terms of a scientific concept. If you grow the same plant all over the place and something bad happens, all of it will be subject to that. Okay? And there aren't very many preventive measures in place to prevent just widespread use of the same plant. What's interesting is, so this article was written in 2001, and the same author updated the article in 2006. So we can get a sense of sort of how everything evolved from about 9 years ago to about 4 years ago. Okay? And so the article is very similar, okay, but you can see some things got shuffled around. So the 2006 version of the article had the same 3 worries, but put them in a different order. Okay, so number 1 worry as of 4 years ago is the superweeds. And actually, by 2006, superweeds had emerged. It was clear. It was incontrovertible. There were weeds that were resistant to these herbicides. The sightings of these weeds were increasing in numbers, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. The second worry then is the failure worry, because this in itself is a contributing factor, or could be a contributing factor to failure of the crop. Okay, so that got elevated in importance. And the idea that innocent creatures will be hurt by insecticides that are built into the crops diminished a bit, although there's still that potential. Okay, there'd been more research on it, and the EPA got into the business and said, well, there's no these crops don't pose an unreasonable threat to non-target organisms. Okay, and I think this is an interesting sort of situation to compare. It gives you sort of the sense of what was in the mindset of the population about 9 years ago versus about 4 years ago. And the thing I would point out is that this, I think, is a very sort of sentimental notion. It might very well be true that monarch butterflies could be harmed by genetically modified crops. But it's common when there's not a lot of information out there to sort of hook into something that sort of touches people's emotions in some way. And monarch butterflies are beautiful and at risk, and we have to do something about it, and these crops are just causing more problems. I think when more scientific research happens and bigger concerns emerge, you see these sort of sentimental reasons drifting out of the list of important things, and the real concerns start topping the list. So before we talk about some of this stuff again, what I want to just give you an impression of now is sort of how widespread these crops are, because you might not have much sense of it. As I said last time, in the US, food doesn't have to be labeled if it's genetically modified, so you might have no idea sort of how much of what you eat is actually genetically engineered. So I just want to give you some statistics, again, as an overview of sort of where these things are being grown, what types of crops are being grown in this way, and so on. So as of the year 2000, this is the picture of where genetically modified crops are being grown. So if you take the sort of the total production of genetically modified crops, and you ask what percentage of that total production is in the US versus other countries, here's what it is. Okay, so it probably doesn't surprise you to find that about 70% of genetically modified crops were produced in the United States. Okay, number 2 might be surprising to you. Okay, Argentina, very heavy into genetically modified crops. And then you have sort of lower representation. Canada was pretty high. This is mostly canola, which is used for vegetable oil, right? China, 1%. And then a few countries, but not very many, in this other category, a very, very small percentage of genetically modified crops. Again, we can fast forward about 5 years and see how this picture has changed. Okay? So the share that's the US share is less, okay, only about half. Argentina is still a big player. Canada is still a big player. Brazil just leapfrogged out of nowhere to 10% of the world's production of genetically modified crops. Okay? China quadrupled in 5 years from about 1% to about 4%. And the list of others just got longer, okay? Including a lot of countries you might not typically associate with sort of modern agricultural practices, okay? So the trend from here to here is very clear. It's that more people are getting into the genetically modified crop game, okay? And as a result, the US share is slightly smaller, and some countries are becoming major players in that. What I should point out, though, is that it looks maybe to you like the US, that genetically modified crops are becoming less important in the US, but that's not how you should read this, because the entire pie got bigger also over these 5 years, as you'll see. Okay? So US use of genetically modified crops has been increasing, but as a percentage of the world production, it's been less. Okay? So if you're interested in sort of finding where in the world these genetically modified crops are produced and what types of things are being produced, Science Magazine has a nice little web interface where you can explore the map and see what's going on. So you can sort of click on your favorite country, right? So if I click over here on India, it tells me things about India's production of genetically modified crops as of 2007. So in India, for example, the major production of genetically modified crop was of cotton, okay? Not much of the other crops that are typically genetically modified grown in India. You might have read a couple of months ago that there was a big to-do over genetically modified eggplants in India, okay? So there was some effort being made to introduce a genetically modified eggplant variety in India. It was very controversial. It looked for a while like the government was going ahead with approval for it, although there was a lot of resistance at sort of local level. And a couple of months ago, the Indian government actually decided that to ban the release of the genetically modified eggplant, at least temporarily, until more research had been done, because they were not satisfied that the appropriate sort of ecological impact statements and economic concerns had been met with regard to that. Okay? But you can look at this pipeline category is really interesting. So there's eggplant, but in addition to sort of more countries getting into the use of genetically modified crops, you see more crops being genetically modified that are more specific to particular countries' production. So cauliflower, okra, cabbage, and so on are in the pipeline in India. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to sort of poke around this website and see what's being produced where. So this is where I think the really sort of surprising statistics start, and that has to do with how much of the global food supply actually is genetically modified. So this is a chart showing just 5 years, from 1995 to the year 2000, how much, in terms of total area planted, was genetically modified organisms. Okay, so what you can see is in 1995, there was basically essentially zero genetically modified organisms being planted. And this took off extremely rapidly. Okay, so within the course of 5 years, the total area planted with genetically modified crops was 44 million hectares. So what's a hectare? A hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters. So it's about 2.5 acres. It's about 3 football fields side by side. Okay, so this is about 100 million football fields worth of crop is genetically modified as of the year 2000. And it might, and you can see that that is mostly in industrial nations, and this number is mostly the U.S., okay? But by 2000, many developing nations, as you saw, Brazil, for example, which would probably be counted in that category, are contributing to the genetically modified food supply. It might look to you like it started to level off between 99 and 2000, right? It looks like maybe that was it. Turns out that was a minor blip, okay? So if we fast forward again 5 years, there's that blip that looked like it was leveling off, but it just kept taking off from there. So we have linear increase in the total area of genetically modified crops continuing from about 1995 to 2005, and it keeps going. So today, this total is well over 100 million hectares total, okay, for genetically modified crops. And the other thing you can see is that developing nations are increasing faster even than industrial nations. Okay, so which crops are these? What are these fields being planted with? The major, and this again might be surprising to you if you haven't read about this or thought about this before, the major genetically modified crop by far is soybeans. Okay, why soybeans? Anyone have an idea why soybeans are such a major crop here? It is. But does this mean, you know, everyone's eating edamame all of a sudden? Why 60% soybeans? So such as? So most of it is grown in the U.S., remember, too. Okay, so the tofu market in the U.S. is still relatively small. Oops, where did we lose that? Sorry about that. In your diet, when are you eating soybeans? Anyone eat soybeans? Soy milk, minor. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So do you know what form it's usually entering those things in? Not usually. Nope. All out of guesses? It's mostly soybean oil. Someone was going to say that. So if you've ever had sort of partially hydrogenated blah, 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 blah oil, like trans fats, that usually starts out as soybean oil, soy oil. Okay, and so that's like, you know, potato chips, every fried food you've ever had, lots of these sort of heavily processed things like candy bars. As you'll see, no, because the soybeans are usually not engineered to be resistant to disease. Most of these are just engineered to be resistant to the herbicide. They're actually quite hardy plants. Yeah, so they basically enter our food supply as calories, right? That's one way to think of it. You know, they're a lot of filler products, like these oils that things are fried in and so on, are soybean oil. Corn, probably not surprising. That's a major crop in the U.S., as you know, so that 23% of the total genetically modified food is corn. Shouldn't be that surprising. So canola, right, again, oil, right? And cotton. So those are the four big ones in terms of being genetically modified. They have been since the start, and they still are. Okay, and so this is sort of the breakdown of what they're modified for. Okay, so 3/4 of genetically modified product that's made is genetically modified to be resistant to herbicide. Okay, that's this sort of weed killer aspect, right? And virtually all of this is resistance to one herbicide called Roundup. Okay, so one chemical being sprayed on plants accounts for 75% of the genetic modification of the food and cotton supply. About 20% is modified to be resistant to insects, and again, this is pretty much only Bt toxin. So this part of the pie is really only two modifications. It's being resistant to Roundup as an herbicide and being engineered to have Bt toxin. Okay, and then this part of it is just that it's both. Okay, Bt toxin plus Roundup resistant. Okay, so still, this picture of things doesn't give you a sense of like how much of the food supply is genetically modified. It just tells you how much of the genetically modified food supply is this versus that. Okay? So what the next graphs will show you is sort of how much of our food supply is actually made up of these genetically modified organisms. So here we have the four biggies, okay? Soybeans, corn, cotton, canola, okay? And each bar, the total height is how much is grown, just total, irrespective of whether it's genetically modified or not, okay? So you can see that corn is a huge crop, right? Accounting for almost 150 million hectares of land, okay? Followed by soybeans, which is about 70, cotton, canola. And then the bars are broken down into what proportion of that is genetically modified and what proportion of it is not genetically modified, okay? So if we take soybeans, for example, we have about 1/3 of the soybean crop being genetically modified and 2/3 not being genetically modified. Okay? For corn, much more of it is not genetically modified. 93% not genetically modified, 7% genetically modified. Likewise, for cotton, it's only about 16% genetically modified, 84% not genetically modified. Canola, 11% genetically modified, the rest 89% not genetically modified. Okay, so soybeans are the biggest in terms of the percentage of the total crop that's genetically modified. Okay, the other half of this, right? So over here we have again the same crops: soybeans, corn, cotton, canola, and this is how they're engineered. So this is what I was just saying, right? So all of the engineered soybeans are engineered to be resistant to this herbicide. Okay, they're not engineered to have Bt toxin in them, right? All of the engineered canola is resistant to the herbicide. It's not about resistant to insects, okay? And then corn and cotton have been engineered to be resistant to both, either one at a time, or some plants are resistant to both together. So here we have herbicide resistance, insect resistance, and both. Herbicide, insect, both. Okay, but again, all of this is pretty much just two modifications, either separate or together. Bt toxin or Roundup. And again, we can look at the trends here. So this is from 2001. The last slide is from 2001, so we can get an update here and see where it's gone. Okay, and so here's the update. So this was the 2001 numbers and the 2006 numbers. So these numbers have stayed pretty much the same. So the fraction of genetically modified crop production that was soybeans has stayed pretty much constant. The fraction that's corn has stayed pretty much constant. Cotton, canola, pretty much constant. Okay, so that aspect has not changed. We don't see this pie sort of opening up to a lot of other crops quite yet. Although that's happening, they don't represent a large proportion of total production just because these crops are so dominant. And really the only big change with respect to how they're modified is that we have more cases of both herbicide resistance and insect resistance engineered into the same plant. So in 2001, it was about 7% being modified for both, and in 2006, it's about 11%. Okay? Not a big change, but a change in the direction of combining these things into the same plants. Okay? This, I believe, is global. Okay? And I'm pretty sure it's global, and I'll explain why on the next slide. Okay? So this is the update of the percentage of total crop that's genetically modified. Okay? So as of 2006, 60% of soybeans genetically modified, 40% not modified. So that went up from about 1/3 genetically modified to about 2/3 of genetically modified. And in the US, that number is about 90%. Okay, so in the US, 90% of soybeans are genetically modified. That means every bag of potato chips you've eaten where there's soybean oil used, you've probably eaten genetically modified soy. Okay, corn has increased, so from 7% of total area genetically modified to 14%, so a doubling of the percentage of genetically modified corn. Cotton, likewise, went from about 16% to about 28%, almost doubling. Canola went from 11% to 18%, okay, a big increase. So that's the trend. There's no doubt about it. That's the trend, that this part of the bar is increasing relative to the non-genetically modified version. And for soybeans in the US, it's virtually complete. There are practically, as a percentage, there's practically no soybeans that are grown in the US that are not resistant to Roundup. And this you can look at on your own too. Basically, you see what I've said before, which is that both categories increasing relative to the other categories. Okay, to put this in perspective, by the way, so if we say, okay, 14% of corn is genetically modified and the rest is not. Anyone have an idea what percentage of U.S. agriculture is organic? So like when I say 14% is genetically modified and I wanted to divide this, obviously you'd be dividing the non-genetically modified part for the organic side of things, right? So how much of this bar would be organic? Anyone have a guess? I actually don't know what it is for corn. I know what it is sort of for all agriculture in general. Anyone have guessed what that percentage is? 20%? Any other guesses? 10%? Any other guesses? 1%. We have a winner. Okay? It's about 1%. Right? So that puts these kind of things in perspective. I mean, you guys, you probably walk by Whole Foods all the time. You think the world is organic, right? But tiny, tiny percentage of agriculture, especially when compared to genetically modified. Okay. And as I said, these are the four main crops: soybeans, corn, cotton, canola, but other things are sort of joining the ranks, and some of them have the potential to really take off because they already, those crops at least, represent a large proportion of the food supply. And so once genetic engineering of those crops takes hold, then there's a potential for widespread change in the plants that are being used for that crop. So here's one. Does anyone know what this guy is sitting on? This is one of the up-and-coming genetic modifications. Anyone know what he's sitting on? You can see him better down here. It looks like potatoes. Okay, it's not potatoes, but it does look like potatoes. It's not mushrooms. He's holding one in his hand, right? So, anyone know what that is? You're so unaware of what you eat. You're eating this all the time. All the time. It's a beet. Okay? You all eat beets all the time, right? You're saying no. Yes, you do. Okay. So beets are a huge, huge part of the agriculture industry in this country. So there are 10,000 U.S. farmers growing beets. 1.3 million acres grown of beets total. Why is that? You're obviously not eating them. Who is? Oh. give you a clue. If you cut open one of these beets, it's not red. So unaware of what you put in your body. Okay, sugar. Half of our sugar supply comes from sugar beets, right? You think it comes from sugar cane? Nope. Most of it comes from sugar beets, right? So this will be sort of potentially the next major engineered crop. And as I said before, other things are in the pipeline too, depending where you look. There are eggplants, cabbage, cauliflower, all kinds of things. But again, most of them are modified with one of those two modifications that already exist. Okay, there's not a lot of movement in terms of how the plants are being modified, but there is some movement in terms of what modification is actually done. So I want to talk a little bit more about this one particular. We talked about BT last time. I want to talk about Roundup this time. So Roundup is the best-selling agrochemical of all time. Okay, it has use from fields being sprayed with it like this, to people going to their local garden store and getting their spray bottle of Roundup to spray on their weeds on their walkway out front of their house. To the U.S. government is a large buyer of Roundup. Do you know why that is? Stumping you guys today. Close. Mostly coca. Okay, so they take planes down to suspected cocaine-growing fields in Latin America, and they spray them with Roundup. So the biggest use of Roundup is actually these two plants that are crops that are engineered to be resistant to it. So one is soy, and the other is canola. Okay, and the way they were made resistant is just by inserting a bacterial gene. So what Roundup does is it basically will kill any plant, right? And so these Roundup-ready crops are plants that have been engineered with a bacterial gene so that they're not killed by this chemical. Okay? So that's why you can spray them over an entire field of canola, right? And the canola is fine, but any other plant that was growing there will die. It's advertised at least as being not harmful to us because the chemical is actually targeting an enzymatic pathway in plants that we don't have. Okay? So the idea is that that's why it's killing plants and it's not killing insects, it's not killing rodents, it's not killing humans, although there are reports of farm workers becoming sick from high exposures to it. Okay. As I said, this is like the major modification of plants. Okay, so basically much of the genetically modified crop industry is due to this one chemical and its resistance gene. And as a business concept, this is a great idea for the chemical company, right? So the chemical companies have this wonderful history of helping mankind, right? So they started out with bombs, right? And they moved on to like Agent Orange, and then they moved on to nitrogen fertilizers. And now what they do is they sell you the chemical, this herbicide, and they sell you the plant. So these chemical companies have become agribusiness companies. And as you'll see, they have these really sort of nasty business practices where when you buy their seeds, you sign a contract that says you're not going to give those seeds to anybody else, that says you're not going to recover the seeds from the plants you grow and plant those seeds again, so that you have to buy the seeds every year from them. And so they've set up this real dependent relationship where you buy the chemical and the seeds from the company every year. Okay, and that goes against sort of long-standing traditional agricultural practice. And they've been wildly, wildly successful at it. Okay, and so you can see from this timeline of the global area of biotech crops again, how much of it is insect resistance, how much of it is both insect and herbicide, and then this line is just the herbicide. Okay, so and a lot of this increase is due to just sort of soybeans, genetically engineered soybeans being increasingly used. Okay, and farmers are in kind of a bind because if the farmer next door to you is using this stuff and getting good yields and everything, then there's a lot of pressure on you to use the same thing, even if you didn't want to in the first place. The widespread use of Roundup, which I haven't said the name yet, but this is the chemical name of Roundup. It's glyphosate. The widespread use of this chemical has, as I said, started to lead to the emergence of superweeds. Okay, so here's a picture of a superweed, right? So this is in a field of soybeans. Okay, so I mean, you can just get a sense of the scale of production of these things by looking at the field. Forget about the weed for a second. But you know, this field goes on forever and ever and ever. Okay, this is basically one farm, right? And you have this weed growing in the middle of it, and the reason it's growing, and the reason, you know, everything else is really clear is because the whole field has been sprayed with Roundup, and this plant is resistant to it. Okay, and the first resistant weed was identified around the year 2000. Okay, and since then it's turned up pretty much everywhere where you have widespread use of the Roundup-ready crop. Okay, about a quarter of farmers in different places of the U.S. that grow soybeans have now experienced some kind of weed like this, and the trend is a little bit scary. Okay, so here's the trend. This is the number of identified weed species that have become resistant to glyphosate. And pretty much all of them, as far as I can tell, are resistant not because they got genes from the Roundup-ready crop, but because they actually evolved resistance on their own. Okay, some rare plant of that species was, for whatever reason, resistant to this chemical, and now it's a superweed and can grow in the presence of it. Okay, so 96, basically the first case. By 2000, people were sure that these were superweeds. And look at the trend. So just 5 years later, you go from 2 recognized cases in terms of number of species to 12. Okay? And if you follow this trend line, basically, this should be scaring all of the executives from Monsanto, which is the company that makes Roundup, scaring them like crazy, right? Because you know what this basically means is this chemical is going to become ineffective soon, right? Because if you have this much widespread resistance to the chemical, then the whole principle of using it goes away, right? If you spray the whole field and all the weeds still grow, then the chemical isn't doing its job. Okay, so it should scare Monsanto, and you would imagine that what they're doing now is trying to come up with, you know, version 2.0 of this, right? Some other mechanism for herbicide resistance, some other chemical perhaps that they could sell in this way. It also is just scary in terms of the food supply, right? So if basically the widespread use of, say, genetically modified soybeans means pretty much the same plant is being grown over a very, very wide acreage in this country and other countries. And we've seen in the past what happens when that situation applies. So the famous example, which I've said before, is the potato famine in Ireland, right? And the issue there really was, it was basically one potato variety that was being planted there. The potato blight fungus comes in, and then the whole crop fails because there's no other varieties being planted. At the same time, in Latin America, you know, many varieties of potatoes were being planted. Potato blight was still around, but it didn't cause any problem, okay, because of that natural variety that was being used and planted. You might not realize, but we've had a major failure, sort of the scale of the Irish potato famine in the U.S. not too long ago, okay? And this was in about 1970, and it had to do with corn. In 1970, 85%, and this is before genetic engineering, right? It's after the Green Revolution, but it's before genetic engineering. And 85% of the US corn crop was actually just one variety of corn. Okay? And what happened there was the same thing that happened to the potatoes in Ireland. A particular disease of the corn plant started spreading. In this case, it's called corn leaf blight. And depending which part of the country the corn was being grown on, either somewhere between half your crop and all of your crop failed. So these are corn plants that are succumbing to this leaf blight, okay, and basically start losing their ability to grow corn cobs. Okay. So this is the same problem. It was pre-genetic engineering, but it's the same problem. And that's the problem of monoculture. When you grow the same thing all over the place, and something bad arises that can damage that one thing, then all of it will be subject to that damage. And when it's the corn crop, you lose a major source of food in this country. You know, when it's the soybean crop, it causes problems, and so on and so on. And I'll talk about, in the last lecture, I'll talk about, you know, cases where basically we can think of this either as sort of a national or international problem when something like this happens. But it also sort of has very, very strong, you know, personal repercussions for the farmers involved. And there have been cases of crop failures in the very recent past, in the last few years, of genetically modified crops where they've failed, and it's led to suicide of farmers and some really serious problems that certainly the agribusiness companies don't typically worry about. Okay, so what I want to do now is sort of present sort of a personal story about Monsanto, about Roundup, about what this really dramatic change in our food supply does both at the systemic level in terms of the production of our food and also at the personal level in terms of people trying to make a living as farmers. And so the case I want to talk about is the case of this farmer. His name's Percy Schmeiser, and I'm going to show you a pretty long clip of this movie, The Future of Food, which talks about his case. But just to introduce it, the things I've been saying about sort of, you know, monoculture and dependence on the same company for chemicals and seed every year, I think the way to understand it is that food is not just, you know, what we eat. It's a huge industry. It's a means of livelihood for a large number of people across the globe. And changes to the way that system works affect people really, really strongly. Okay? And in particular, the situation with the way Monsanto deals with its farmers has been called bioserfdom. Right? It's the idea that you have this high-tech new way of doing things, but it's really the old way of doing things, which is that the farmers are dependent on the lords. Okay? And in this case, the lords are a company called Monsanto. And there are other companies too, Sigma, Bayer, you know, on and on and on. Okay? So if you look up Monsanto, you find that there's really strong reaction against it. So on this site, Ethical Investing, so if you guys are trading stocks and want to be somewhat not soulless about it, it's a recommended website that tells you sort of what companies are doing and whether you should really be investing in them. So it labels Monsanto as basically the worst. So the world's most unethical and harmful investment is Monsanto. And so I have to tell you this story. So I was in the elevator last year in Silver, and one of my students from 3 years ago got in the elevator and said, "Hey, professor, how you doing? I really liked your class. I learned a lot." And so I said, "Well, what did you learn?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I really remembered that lecture you gave about Monsanto where you're telling how evil their business practices were. And so I got a lot out of that because, you know, I figured for a company to be that evil, they must make a lot of money. So I bought their stock, and I made a lot of money on their stock. So if there are any of you who are thinking of doing the same thing, please don't. You know, if you need some money, I don't know, get a second job. please don't invest in Monsanto. Especially after you watch the movie I'm going to show you. I don't think you're going to want to. I'd much rather have you join Millions Against Monsanto or what are these other consumer advocacy websites? Because basically what they do is they use intimidation practices against farmers. They use really, really nasty ways of getting farmers to sort of rat on each other. It's very sort of old school, almost East German about it. And as I said, what they do is they get you to buy their seeds and chemicals every year, which becomes expensive, but you're in this sort of race against all of the other farmers. And if you don't adopt the same modern practices as them, then you might not be able to sell your crop. And indeed, there's this extra added layer of dependency where unless you grow the approved variety, right, you might not even be able to sell what you grow. They do intimidate farmers. They bribe other farmers for information on the farmers that they're going to intimidate. And the worst of all, I think, is that their share of the food supply is gigantic, right? And so, in a way, we're handing over the stewardship of our food supply to one company, which is never a good idea in the first place. Okay, so with that introduction, I'm going to play this clip. It's about 12 minutes long, so sit tight, enjoy. Well, don't really enjoy, but pay attention.
In Canada, the question of patenting landed directly in Percy Schmeiser's field.
I've been farming for 53 years, and in those years I've grown mostly wheat, canola, oats, and peas. This field has had wheat, and the field behind me has canola in it, or rapeseed as it is known in Europe. When our grandparents came to this country, there was no such thing as chemical companies or seed companies, and they had to rely and develop their own seed, borrow seed from their neighbors, or bring it from Europe with them.
Percy was known in this part of Canada as a seed developer and a seed saver.
I would say that our best grains, our best seeds, have not been developed by research people or scientists. They have been developed by farmers.
In 1997, Percy sprayed Monsanto's Roundup around the power poles and ditches as he had done for years. Some canola plants did not die.
I thought initially that some of those plants didn't die because I had been spraying year after year after year with Roundup in the same area, and companies warn you you shouldn't spray every year because you could develop a resistance. Monsanto found out about it, and they went on my land that I farmed without my knowledge, without my permission, and took plants or seeds and said some of that was Monsanto's Roundup Ready canola. In August the 6th of 1998, they launched a lawsuit against me.
Monsanto claimed that Percy had illegally obtained their genetically modified canola without a license and had infringed on their patent.
Patents historically have been for things like, I've used the example of a carburetor. Well, a carburetor doesn't get up one day and start replicating itself everywhere and introducing itself into your car so that all of a sudden you have somebody else's carburetor one morning and then you get sued for patent infringement. So that's the unique nature of this type of technology, that once you've unleashed it into the environment, uncontrolled and unconfined, it will spread everywhere.
Before the main trial, Monsanto withdrew then all their allegations against me that I had ever obtained a seed illegally. And they went on to say that it didn't matter how the seed got on to my land, I still infringed on their patent.
Because my land is on the east side of the road, the main road, the prevailing winds here are from the west. So it would be natural for the canola that blew off of trucks to land in the field here. In fact, one farmer told me that when he drove past my land hauling a Roundup-ready canola, his tarp had broken, and he estimated he lost enough past my 2 miles of land to seed 2,000 acres.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues in the case is where to draw the line between the people and the companies who produce and come up with this new technology. The line ended up being drawn way into the farmers' fields. And our contention was the line should clearly be drawn such that farmers have a right to continue to farm. They should be able to save and reuse their own seed. They should be able to buy seed, conventional seed, from their neighbors as they've had in the past without having to worry about whether they're infringing somebody's patent now.
1999, when I went to seed my canola fields, I was advised by my lawyer not to use my own seed again because I now knew it was contaminated by Monsanto's genetic altered canola. And it was seed that was adapted to this region and grew quite well because it was resistant to various diseases.
Percy destroyed over 1,000 pounds of seed that he and his wife had developed over decades.
The lawsuit and my loss of my seeds was the hardest thing that could have ever happened to us.
Now here Monsanto comes along, what we worked for all these years, they just want to take it away just like that from us. I could never do that. To go into their office and take anything, I would be prosecuted. And they can just come and do anything to the farmers just like they own them or so. It really is upsetting. And I feel they've taken my rights away and my privacy. And we're not the only ones they've been doing to, as many others. Why are they prosecuting so many of these little farmers? Well, they only may be worth a couple of 100,000 when they're such a multinational company. Why? Is it greed, or is it they just want to control all the seeds?
Percy was not the only farmer accused by Monsanto.
In the summer of 2000, my family and I were discussing how rude we thought it was that Monsanto never sent us a letter or thanked us for cooperating with their investigation into our business. We were stunned when in late July of the year 2000, we received a letter from a law firm in New Orleans that was representing Monsanto Company, accusing us of infringing on their patent. Every accused grower in the United States that I have talked to had nearly identical stories. They come and test your crop. The farmers that have nothing to hide figure, well, they'll find that we didn't plant this crop that they say, and they come back over a year later and accuse you of this when the farmer can't go back and take crop samples and disprove them. Monsanto had told us that they had sampled all 3,850 acres of our soybean crop. The samplers would have had to have been gathering one sample continuously every 20 seconds. After examining the testimony that we gave, realized their story didn't add up. Now they changed their story, saying they only took a handful of samples per field. Are we to assume that they were lying in their first attempt to extort money from us, or are they lying now?
Estimates are that Monsanto has sent out 9,000 letters to farmers. Most farmers choose to pay to avoid lawsuits. Even so, there are 100 active lawsuits in the United States alone. When the farmers do settle with Monsanto, they have to agree to never discuss their settlement.
We feel that we were profiled by Monsanto because of the size of our farm, and that they wanted to try to make an example out of us to scare other farmers into never saving their own seed, to be too scared to save their own seed.
If Eventually, my case went to court after 2.5 years, and Monsanto dragged me through those courts in pre-trial. They did everything to break me and basically took all of our retirement funds because just my lawyer fees alone up to date have been around $200,000.
One of the sons said, "Mom and Dad, I hope it won't get you down because they're trying to destroy you. But I hope you're strong and you just get through it all." He says, that's the only way the changes will be made in our country with these big companies.
Monsanto ready to wage war. Schmeiser's case opened the door for Monsanto to pursue other patent breaches. A lot of people have asked me why I didn't just settle. I probably could have settled for maybe a slap on the wrist or maybe a few $1,000 fine. But what I did was talk it over with my wife and said, look, they destroyed our seed, everything we've worked for in the last 50 years, and if I sign this, that I grew genetic altered canola without a license when we were doing our own thing, minding our own business, I couldn't live with myself. And I feel that it was taking my fundamental rights away from me. My grandparents left a system like that way back turn of the century to get away from control and a feudal type system. Are we going to want to go back to that? And we said no. We'll fight it and stand up for what we believe in.
And what did the judge rule after 2.5 weeks of trial? He said it didn't matter how Monsanto's genetic altered canola got into my field. And then he went on and specified. He said whether it cross-pollinated or if it blew in by the wind, by birds, bees, animals, or falling off a farmer's truck, a combine, and so on, it didn't matter. The fact that there was some plants there, I violated Monsanto's patent, even though I didn't want it in my field. Number 2, which is the most important one, I think, he ruled any farmer that has a regular conventional plant, it doesn't matter what kind of plant, if it's a tree, if it's a seed, and it gets cross-pollinated with Monsanto's gene against your wishes and destroys your property, my plant becomes Monsanto's property. Now stop and think what that means to farmers all over the world, farmers, gardeners, anything to do with a life-giving form. The third issue he ruled, the fact that I never used Monsanto's patent, which means I never used Monsanto's Roundup Ready herbicide or glyphosate on my crop, he ruled that's immaterial. He said the fact was that there were some plants there. So that shows you the power of patent law over farmers' rights.
If you go and look at a canola field that's 1/2 GMO, 1/2 regular canola, you will not be able to tell the difference between the two. They grow the same, they act the same. The only way you'll be able to discover it's there is if you go spray Roundup. Well, what you killed is your own, and what survived belongs to Monsanto now as a result of this case.
In the last 2 months, I probably had 100 phone calls, minimum, about people finding canola in their fields that never ever had it before. And I think it would be safe to say that it would be very difficult to find one field in Western Canada that would not now be contaminated to some degree with Monsanto's GMO canola.
There's an old sort of ethic that emerged in agriculture communities, and I grew up with that ethic. And the basic ethic was that if I decided to bring an agricultural enterprise into my neighborhood that was potentially damaging to my neighbors, for example, if I decide to raise cattle and those cattle are potentially very damaging to my neighbor's crops, it's my responsibility to fence the cattle in. It's not my neighbor's responsibility to fence them out to prevent damage to his crops. The way that the system is functioning now, it's my responsibility to fence that technology out from my crops. And of course, there's no way that you can build a fence high enough to prevent that. We know that now.
All species have developed elaborate mechanisms over millions.
All right, so just to give you a sort of update of where that ended up, so you saw what the judge ruled and the Supreme Court ruled is that, in a sense, it didn't matter how the canola got into Percy's field, that it sort of belonged to Monsanto, and it was, in a sense, his fault, right? And you can imagine what it would take for a farmer to prevent seed like that from getting into his field. You could also imagine how kind of bizarre a ruling that is. Like if someone just sort of took Monsanto Roundup Ready seed and threw it into, you know, a real active decision, threw it into his field, it would be his fault. And so the judge ruled that it didn't matter how it got there, it belonged to Monsanto, and if that seed was saved or sold, that Monsanto, in a sense, owned it and deserved the profits from it. Percy countersued Monsanto, and that suit was settled about 2 years ago. It was a settlement, but it was a much better situation for Percy. You can't say he won because it was a settlement, but basically, part of the settlement, Monsanto agreed to pay for the costs of cleaning up their Roundup Ready canola that had contaminated his fields, which you would think would be the automatic thing to happen anyway. If I, threw a bunch of paint on your house and you didn't want it on your house, it would be my responsibility to clean it up, right? But the logic of that got sort of perverted in this situation originally. So that the settlement reversed that, at least to the right order of things, that Monsanto was responsible for cleaning it up. And then the other important thing that Percy did in that settlement is he refused to have a gag order. So as you saw in the clip, all of the other farmers who had ever settled with Monsanto not only had to sign the settlement agreement and usually pay some kind of settlement to Monsanto, but they also had to sign a gag order that said they wouldn't talk about it. Okay, and it's a common thing to do, right? So that the different farmers who were involved could not cooperate with each other, and also just to prevent bad sort of PR from happening, you have these gag orders. So Percy wouldn't go for that, and he said, his settlement included no gag order. And so, in a sense, that was a landmark settlement. It's not a ruling, right? It's not a court precedent, but it's a settlement because it sort of changed the way Monsanto has to go about things now. He sort of stood up to them. There's no gag order, and also they're responsible for reimbursing him instead of the other way around. But it's hard to say whether that's going to have a huge effect on how a company like that does business. There's still a huge profit motive involved, and who knows? Monsanto might see this as just sort of a blip on the road, and not really change the way they deal with other farmers, because, as I said, the farmers are really dependent on them, and in some cases can't sell their product without it being Monsanto product. Okay, so that's the end of the sermon.